The lush green hills of the Yorkshire Dales stretched out beneath a grey English sky. Like a painting from the medieval ages. The air was utterly still, broken only by the wind that swept through winding ancient stone walls, walls that had stood for hundreds of years. Silent witnesses to all things that came and went. Tucked into that landscape was Thornfield Farm, an old farmstead with weathered red tile roofs and barns built from rough stone. But today, it was no longer the peaceful place of harvest seasons. It carried the breath of a battlefield. William Whitmore, a widower in his 60s, stood by the wooden fence, his hands clenched tight, eyes fixed on the large cattle barn in the distance. At the center of the barn stood a massive beast, jet black. Muscles like steel, horns curved like battle blades, Brutus. The breeding bull weighing over a ton. Hailed as the pride of Angus stock in North Yorkshire. But now, he was a nightmare. For the past 3 months. Since Jack Morrison, the farm's longtime cattleman, vanished without a trace. Brutus had become a threat. He had broken a vet's ribs, nearly killed 2 hired workers, and most recently, tried to smash the iron gate of the barn with his head. "He's getting worse by the day," William muttered, his gaze never leaving the creature. Beside him, Mrs. Hartwell, the silver-haired, stern but kind housekeeper, nodded silently. "That animal is no longer right, Mr. William. Perhaps it's time to sell him, before someone loses their life." William tightened his jaw. "No, Brutus is the best breeding bull we've had in 3 generations. His bloodline is worth a fortune. There has to be another way." Through the heavy clouds above, a small car rolled up the gravel path toward the farm. Its tires crackled over the stones. William frowned. The car door opened. Out stepped a thin little boy. About 7 years old. Messy brown hair, pale face, and eyes unusually large. The kind of eyes William would never forget. Eyes of someone who had lost too much and feared nothing anymore. "My name is Jack," the boy said softly, clutching a worn-out backpack with frayed straps. The social worker, Sarah Collins, spoke gently. "He's the child of a distant relative on your late wife's side. His parents died recently in an accident. There's no one else to take him in. If you decline, we'll have to move him to a children's home." William narrowed his eyes. A cold wind swept through his silver hair. "I don't know how to raise children. This is a farm, not a place to play house." But before Sarah could respond, Mrs. Hartwell spoke, for the first time, with firm resolve. "Mr. William, this house once echoed with the laughter of children. It needs to hear it again. And this boy, he needs a home. Even if it's a home full of cow dung. It's better than the loneliness he's known." Jack didn't cry. He simply nodded. It was not a pleading nod, nor one of hope. It was the kind of nod that belonged to someone used to not being chosen. "Spare rooms upstairs," William muttered, avoiding those eyes. "If you need anything, ask Mrs. Hartwell." The door opened, to let in a child orphaned by life. Into a place once filled with love, and then emptied of it all. Outside, Brutus still stood silently in his pen, his dark eyes deep as a chasm. And here, a boy who had just lost everything, quietly stepped onto a land that would forever change his life. The next dawn arrived shrouded in thick fog, the sky still bearing that heavy leaden hue so characteristic of early winter days in Yorkshire. In the warm kitchen of Thornfield Farm, the scent of black tea and toasted bread wafted through the small room. Mrs. Hartwell was pouring milk into a bowl of cereal for Jack, who sat quietly on the wooden chair, holding a spoon but not yet eating. William had left early, heading to Grassington to meet with the village farmers at the Devonshire Arms pub. Continuing the debate about Brutus, whether to sell him, or to resort to strong tranquilizers. Mrs. Hartwell was busy doing laundry in the backyard. Jack ate a few spoonfuls, then quietly slid off his chair. No one noticed. No sound. Only a small hand pushing open the heavy wooden door, and stepping out. Into the cold mist. Jack passed the sheep pen, where the animals huddled together against the chill. Past the chicken coop, where hens quietly preened beneath the pale morning light. He walked straight ahead, without hesitation, as if his feet already knew where they needed to go. And then, before him, appeared Brutus. The bullpen sat apart, fenced with thick oak planks reinforced by steel wires. The ground bore scars of recent attacks, hoof marks, long gouges, splintered beams. Brutus stood still in the center of the pen, his massive body as silent as a block of black stone. That heavy head lowered. His eyes, black, deep, gazed out across the endless field as though he had seen the entire world and returned in silence. Jack stood by the fence. He didn't call. He didn't flinch. He just watched. After a moment, Brutus turned his head. For the past 3 months, anyone who came too close had been met with growls or direct attacks. But this time, the beast merely stood there. He smelled the boy, took a deep breath, and then stepped forward. Not hurriedly, not aggressively, just one step, then another. Each hoofbeat made the ground tremble slightly. But no one, not even Brutus, understood why. Today, he wasn't angry. Jack gently raised his hand, a small hand, dusty with dirt. "You're sad, aren't you?" he whispered, as if not to the animal, but to something deeper, quieter, more aching. Brutus stopped just at the fence, his nose only inches from Jack's hand. His breath came warm and heavy. Then, something no one had ever dared imagine, he lowered his head and let the boy touch him. Above, a sparrow gave a short chirp and darted into the sky. In the backyard, Mrs. Hartwell turned, intending to call Jack in to finish his now cold milk. But she froze. From a distance, she saw Jack place his hand on the forehead of the fierce bull. And Brutus didn't move, didn't growl, didn't buck. "Oh my heavens," she gasped, her hands trembling. "The boy is standing next to death." She started to run, ready to shout, but stopped. Because at that very moment, Brutus let out a low, rumbling sound, not one of threat, but as if he was answering. A moment beyond explanation, beyond repetition, and beyond denial. That afternoon, the sky darkened to a deep gray, as if all of Yorkshire was holding its breath after something extraordinary had just occurred. Brutus, the bull that had terrified everyone, had allowed a 7-year-old boy to touch his forehead. In silence, without a hint of resistance. Mrs. Hartwell didn't tell anyone, yet. She hadn't yet found the words to name what she had just witnessed. Inside the main house, William had returned and placed a stack of newspaper ads on the table, ads to sell the bull. Still unsent, dinner was Yorkshire stew and toasted bread. But everyone ate in silence. Only Jack was different. He sat by the chair near the fireplace, holding an old book Mrs. Hartwell had given him, eyes fixed on the window. Out there, Brutus still walked slowly in his pen like a forgotten god just waking up, quiet and strange. That night, while tidying up the old bookshelf in Margaret's room, William's late wife, Mrs. Hartwell found a faded cardboard box. Inside were dozens of old photographs, most showing charity events, summer fairs, and family celebrations. Her eyes stopped at one faded photo. In the picture, a red-haired woman, Margaret, stood beside a young couple and a small boy. About 2 years old, cheeks rosy, holding up an apple in front of a jet-black calf. "Oh Lord," Mrs. Hartwell whispered, clutching the photo tightly. That calf was Brutus, as a baby, hornless, still bearing the innocence of youth. And that little boy was Jack. Mrs. Hartwell rushed down the stairs, her heart pounding. William sat in silence, a cold cup of tea in his hands. "Mr. William," she said, holding out the photo, "you need to see this." William took it. When his eyes landed on the boy's face in the photo, his breath caught. "It's the boy," he said softly. "Dear God, that's Jack. And them?" She pointed to the young couple in the picture. "Those are his parents. They came here, that year, for the summer fair Margaret organized for underprivileged families from Manchester." William remembered. The summer fair. Music, the laughter of children, bags of caramel sweets, and baby animals brought out for the little ones to play with. Margaret had opened the farm gates to dozens of strangers for a week-long retreat, because she believed nature was the best medicine for weary hearts. And little Jack, who back then barely knew his letters, had once played with Brutus when he was just a calf. When William showed the photo to Jack, the boy's eyes suddenly lit up like a star finally being called by name. "I remember this place now," Jack said, his voice barely a whisper. "This is the yard I played in. And Brutus, he was small then. I fed him an apple." William stood still. Inside him stirred something from far away, like an echo from a past he had unintentionally forgotten. Something that perhaps only a child's heart remained pure enough to carry through all those years. "You've been here before," William repeated, as if speaking to himself. "You and Brutus weren't meeting for the first time. You were just finding each other again." Since that morning, everything at Thornfield Farm began to soften. Not in a magical or grand way. No fireworks, no loud music, but in the kind of quiet only those who've lived long with sorrow can recognize. The silence became less cold. The loneliness, less deep. Brutus no longer broke the fence. No longer foamed at the mouth whenever anyone came near. No more growling at night that terrified the nearby sheep. Now, each morning, just as sunlight cast its first golden hue through the trees, Jack would appear with a bucket of cool water, some sweet grass, and a whisper no one else could hear. William stood at a distance, observing. Mrs. Hartwell would sometimes pause by the window, her dish towel still in hand. No one called it a miracle. They didn't dare, but both knew. Something had changed, not in Brutus, but in the very air of the farm. And then, the strange things began to happen. A pregnant ewe, once notorious for aggression, having knocked down a vet during a routine check, suddenly sat still beside Jack, letting him place his small hand on her belly, as if he were listening to the breath of something soon to arrive. The wild cat that lived on the barn roof, which had never let anyone near, suddenly jumped down into Jack's lap, and purred like a child rediscovering its mother's warmth. Even the hens, usually frantic whenever someone approached the nesting co-op, let Jack collect their eggs one by one without a single flap or squawk. William started writing it all down. Not for science, but out of fear. He feared he was imagining things. Feared that if he didn't record it, one day he'd wake up and find it had all been the dream of a tired old man. On Saturday afternoon, while rearranging the spice shelf, Mrs. Hartwell suddenly exclaimed, "Mr. William, do you see it? This farm, it hasn't been this peaceful in years." William simply nodded, but his eyes, well trained in watching animals, never left Jack. That night, as they sat by the fire, William asked, "Jack, where did you learn this? The way you touched Brutus. The way you talk to the animals like they understand." Jack didn't look up from the little book he was doodling in. "I didn't learn it," he answered softly. "I just listen. Animals, they don't speak like people. But if someone really listens, they're always saying something." William sat in silence for a long time. He looked at the boy drawing, a bull with wide eyes, and a small boy sitting by a fence. No sun, no background, just two beings side by side, as if they'd known each other for many lifetimes. "What do you call it?" William asked. Jack thought for a moment, then shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe it's a gift. But not mine. It belongs to the animals. I just didn't give it back." Outside, Brutus lifted his head in the dark. Not because of any sound, but as if he'd just heard someone speak his name. Rumors spread like the wind in Yorkshire, especially the ones no one could explain. And the story of Jack, the boy who could talk to the mad bull Brutus, quickly traveled beyond the stone walls of Thornfield Farm. It began with Mrs. Hartwell, who told the village shopkeeper how Brutus had stood still while Jack stroked his forehead. Then an old gardener overheard and recounted it to his friend at the Devonshire Arms pub. Within a week, people from Grassington to Hebden, even as far as Harriet, knew about the boy who whispers to wild beasts. Curious visitors began arriving. They stopped their cars by the roadside, peering through the wooden fence, hoping to witness a miraculous moment. They saw Jack sitting beside Brutus, saw sheep nestle at his feet, saw a stray dog, long afraid to approach any human, sleep beneath a tree beside the boy for the first time in years. People were awed, they were moved, but some were skeptical. On a foggy morning, Harold Thwaite, a prominent farmer from Hebden known for his stern and old-fashioned ways, came to Thornfield Farm. He stood with arms crossed, observing from a distance as if judging a faulty piece of machinery. "That boy's nothing special. Those animals are just spoiled," he said. William stepped out, calm but firm. "We're not selling anything here, Mr. Harold." Harold sneered. "Animals need discipline, not children whispering nonsense to them. This isn't natural. It's dangerous, nearly witchcraft." That last word rang like an ancient curse, dropping the air around the field by a degree. Inside the fence, Jack didn't notice. He was brushing Brutus's back with a small wooden comb, quietly humming a nursery rhyme no one had taught him. Brutus closed his eyes, as if listening to a melody from another world. That afternoon, William called Jack over. The two of them sat on the steps of the front porch. "You know what people are saying out there?" William asked. Jack nodded slowly. "Some say I'm a little witch. Some say I hypnotized Brutus. And what do you think?" Jack looked out to the pasture, where Brutus lay under the shade of a tree. "They're just afraid of what they don't understand. But Brutus doesn't need to be understood. He just needs someone who won't leave him." William went quiet. He understood that feeling. The feeling of being left behind when Margaret passed. The feeling that no one understood when he shouted that Brutus wasn't a mad beast, just an animal, waiting for the caretaker who would never return. That night, William opened the drawer and pulled out old letters from his wife. In one short, handwritten note, Margaret had once written, "If one day we are no longer here, I hope you'll still keep the door open, because there are beings, human or animal, who only need a place of acceptance to begin again." And now, he realized, that boy was the open door. For all of them, Brutus used to be a nightmare. Now, he was a mystery, something that made adults change the way they stood, the way they looked, and even the way they stayed silent. That early morning, Dr. James Peden, a retired veterinarian from Skipton, returned to Thornfield Farm. He had stepped down half a year earlier. But after hearing rumors about the boy and the bull that listens, he felt something was off, not in a negative way, but in a sense that it exceeded the bounds of knowledge he had always trusted. William greeted him with a solemn handshake. "I didn't ask you here to treat an illness," William said, "but to listen." "Listen to what?" A bull, answering. Brutus was standing under the old elm tree, where he often rested at noon. Jack sat beside him, gently stroking along his neck, a motion that, according to Peden, absolutely shouldn't be done if you still value your life. But Brutus stood still, breathing steadily, his ears perked, as if he was listening closely. "Brutus," Jack said softly, "this man doesn't believe you understand. Show him." Brutus turned his head, didn't growl, didn't charge, but let out a low, steady rumble, not threatening, but clearly a response. Jack continued, whispering, "Do you want some water?" Brutus let out a short grunt, then walked directly toward the water trough, recently filled by Mrs. Hartwell. Peden's eyes widened. "That's learned behavior, perhaps," he mumbled. William said nothing. "Brutus, sit down," Jack said playfully. Something absurd to say to a nearly 1.000 kilogram bull by any rational standard. And Brutus folded his legs, lowering his body, just like a giant dog. Peden held his breath. "This shouldn't be possible. You still think it's just learned reflex?" William asked. "No, this is advanced conditioned response. It's like he understands, not just mimics." Peden spent the entire morning observing. Jack didn't give commands. He conversed, as if talking to an old friend. Brutus didn't perform tricks, he responded with sound. Posture, the tilt of his head, a low rumble, stepping forward or stepping back, all of it like a primordial dialogue between two beings who didn't need spoken language. Before leaving, Peden said to William, "I used to think that after 30 years, I understood animal behavior. But now, I'm not even sure I understand myself." The story of Brutus's responses was no longer just hearsay. The first video was recorded, Jack asking, "Brutus, do you remember who gave you your first apple?" Brutus didn't answer in sound, but he walked slowly toward Jack, bowed his head, and pressed into the boy's chest, like a quiet yes. The video spread quickly on social media. More people from Yorkshire began to visit, but they no longer scoffed. They watched, as if witnessing something sacred being awakened. And William, each night, sitting in the small kitchen, wrote into his journal, "I don't know what Jack is. Not sure if this is a gift or a miracle. But I do know this. For the first time in many years, Brutus is no longer alone. And neither am I." 1 week after the first video went viral, the world no longer stood outside the fence of Thornfield Farm. The wooden gate, once only opened for hay deliveries and the occasional visitor, had now become a staging ground for reporters with tripods, microphones raised, and questions flying like arrows toward the windows of the main house. A reporter from BBC Leeds, a documentary crew on animal behavior from London, and even an American journalist claiming to represent Scientific Observer magazine. They didn't come to destroy, but they didn't know how to be quiet either. Does the boy have psychic abilities? Can he train lions? Is this some form of non-biological empathy? Jack didn't answer. He sat in the old granary, cradling the feral cat he had nursed back to health. Outside, a helicopter from a local TV station screeched overhead like the roar of a world he never invited in. Mrs. Hartwell said firmly, "We can't turn the boy into a circus act." Mr. William. William nodded, his face tense. "I know, but if we say no to everything, will they really leave us alone?" Then one morning, a luxury car from Oxford stopped at the gate. Out stepped Dr. Marcus Whitfield, Britain's leading expert in animal psychology. No camera crew, no journalists, just a leather briefcase, and an unreadable gaze. "I'm not here to judge," he told William. "I came to understand whether what's happening here is a miracle or a dangerous distortion." For 3 days, Dr. Whitfield observed. He watched Brutus lower his head as Jack approached. He took notes when an abandoned sheep lay down by the boy's feet and slept peacefully. He tried speaking with Jack, but the boy only gave short, quiet answers, his gaze neither hostile nor inviting. On the evening of the 3rd day, over dinner, Whitfield said, "I won't deny what the boy does is real, but I'm worried. I've seen gifted children, used, glorified, then broken. This boy doesn't need to be a prodigy. He needs to be a child." William glanced over at Jack, who was quietly eating, the small hand picking up a carrot dipped in sauce, just like any ordinary child. But William knew, Jack wasn't ordinary. And that wasn't the boy's fault. The next day, William rejected all filming requests. He cancelled every interview and established 3 rules. 1. Jack will only help animals within the farm, and only under supervision. 2. No unannounced visitors allowed. 3. The media, out the gate. The public protested. They called William a stubborn old fool, a man smothering a child prodigy. But somewhere no one could film, where no microphone could record. Jack sat beside Brutus. "I don't like the lights," he said. "I just like it here. With you. With the cats. With the smell of straw." Brutus let out a low rumble, like agreement. Rain fell steadily all day, draping all of Yorkshire in a cold grey-blue hue. The ancient stones scattered across the fields were slick with mossy dampness, and the sheep curled beneath the eaves of the barns like old men reminiscing about summers long gone. Inside Thornfield's kitchen, William was stitching the torn strap of Jack's old backpack. The bag had been ripped since the day the boy arrived, but Jack had refused to throw it away. "Because my dad gave it to me before he died," Jack had once said. William's hands were slow, clumsy with the needle. The stitches were uneven, imperfect, but to him, every thread seemed to tug at a memory, one he'd locked away through 2 long winters. That evening, as Jack sat on the porch steps, sketching a sleepy Brutus beside a haypile, William stepped out, carrying 2 mugs of hot cocoa. They sat side by side for a long time, saying nothing. Wind brushed against the wooden fence. In the distance, Brutus lifted his head, as if sensing something about to happen. "Jack," William began, his voice deep but steady. "There's something I'd like to ask you." Jack looked up, his wide brown eyes as quiet and steady as ever. "I know you had parents, and I never want to replace them. But if you want, I could be a father again." The air paused. The sentence was rough, unpolished, not romantic, but in each word was the weight of years spent alone, from a man who once believed he had no right left to love anyone again. Jack put his pencil down. "You really want to be my dad?" William didn't answer with words. He simply nodded, slowly, and held out a folder, official adoption papers, already filled out, just waiting for Jack's signature. A small smile appeared on Jack's lips, the first true smile since the day he arrived. "I'll sign," he said, "but only if you sign something too." From his pocket, Jack pulled out a wrinkled piece of paper, a scribbled drawing of 3 figures. A tall man, a small boy, and Brutus, standing between them, like a soul that bound them all. At the top, in shaky handwriting, "My family." William signed it. They both laughed, for the first time, together. That night, Brutus stepped silently out of his pen, as if drawn by instinct. He stood before the porch, gazing through the window. Jack ran out and wrapped his arms around the bull's neck, resting his head on its broad shoulder. "My family's full now, Brutus," he whispered. "Don't need anything else." Brutus gave a low rumble, a deep sound, like a background score to a wordless victory. The next morning, the sign at the gate was changed. Beneath Thornfield Farm, William had added a hand-carved board of his own. Whitmore and Son. After the day William signed the adoption papers, the air at Thornfield changed. Not because the meals were better, or winter grew any softer, but because everything suddenly had a name. Jack was no longer the boy staying temporarily. Brutus was no longer the dangerous bull. And William, no longer the man stuck in the past. They had become a family. But as with all precious things, peace could not remain isolated forever. A month later, the first letter arrived, from a distant farmer. "I heard about the boy who heals animals. I have a horse named Daisy. No one can go near her since the accident. Would the boy be willing to try?" William intended to say no, because Jack was still so young. But Jack, as always, didn't turn away from souls screaming in silence. "I'll try," he said, "because if Daisy is scared the way Brutus once was, maybe I'll understand her too." Daisy, a chestnut-colored mare with vacant eyes after a vehicle rollover, was brought in. 3 veterinarians had already suggested euthanasia. She wouldn't eat, wouldn't sleep, wouldn't let anyone near. Jack didn't approach immediately. He sat outside her stable for 3 days. A few hours each day. Just reading fairy tales aloud and telling stories of his mother and childhood. On the 4th day, Daisy walked out on her own. Head bowed, nose pressing gently into Jack's shoulder. Word spread quickly. The no-hope cases began arriving. A service dog traumatized after its handler died in a fire. A mother cow who lost her calf and stood frozen beside the water trough for 2 weeks. A falcon kept in captivity so long it had forgotten how to fly. Jack's way wasn't training. He simply sat still, listened, and touched fear, without demanding it disappear. Dr. Peden, now Thornfield's unofficial chronicler, wrote, "This boy doesn't heal with magic. He simply dares to stay beside a creature as it breaks, without walking away. Something most grown-ups can't do, not even for themselves." Thornfield Farm had now become the last stop before people gave up. But William was afraid, not of losing something, but that Jack would give everything, and keep nothing for himself. One night, William sat beside the fireplace, watching Jack doze off on the sofa. Brutus curled nearby like a dream sentinel. "Son," he whispered, "you don't have to save the whole world. If ever there comes a day you're tired, I'll be there to hold you, just like you once held Brutus." Outside, the first snow began to fall. And beneath that first snow of the season, tiny footprints slowly pressed themselves into history. Not with noise, but with silences that could never be ignored. News about the boy who healed animals was no longer confined to Yorkshire. Now, it had appeared in London newspapers, in the science section of the BBC, and even flashed briefly on an international news segment. People called Jack the whispering boy, the empath, the last listener. And then, as with every story that touches something profoundly human, it eventually reached the realm of academic skepticism. 3 weeks after the video of Brutus nodding yes to Jack's whisper went viral, a sleek black car pulled up in front of Thornfield Farm. Out stepped Dr. Marcus Whitfield, professor of animal psychology at Oxford University, a specialist in studying how animal behavior may reflect human projection. William, Jack, and Mrs. Hartwell sat with him in the living room. Brutus was napping outside beneath the old tree. "I'm here as an observer," Whitfield said calmly, "because I'm concerned this child may be getting exploited, or caught in a collective delusion." Jack didn't reply. He simply looked the man in the eyes. Not afraid, not angry, just still. "You believe animals understand human language?" "I believe they understand what people no longer bother to say." Dr. Whitfield gave no reaction, but his gaze hesitated, just slightly. The next day, William brought him to the big pen. "This is Brutus, a bull that once attacked 2 veterinarians. That boy is the only one he hasn't charged, and the only one he listens to." Whitfield stood behind the wooden fence, trying to keep a scientific expression. He gave a dismissive smile. "Animals don't understand human feelings. They react. They don't have complex emotions. Jack, still beside Brutus, lifted his head toward him. Then let him show you. Jack stepped back. Brutus, he thinks you're stupid, that you know nothing, feel nothing. If you understand me, show him. Brutus let out a low, prolonged bellow, not aggressive, but a warning. He stepped forward to the fence, eyes dark and burning. He scraped the ground with his hoof 3 times, like drumming a rhythm. He lifted his horns and stomped hard, making the earth tremble. Dr. Whitfield flinched back half a step. He's performing, he said, though his voice had lost its certainty. It's a learned reaction to hand gestures. Jack said nothing. He turned to Brutus and softly said, "It's okay. He doesn't believe, because no one's ever really listened to him." Brutus immediately stopped. His head lowered, tail swayed gently. Then, he walked away, back into the shade. The entire field fell silent. Dr. Whitfield stood still for a long time. His hand clutched a notebook. He didn't write a thing. "I won't file a report," he finally said. "But I'm not changing my stance. Children need truth, not the fantasy of humanized animals." Jack walked up to him. Not confrontational, just asking, "Do you have a best friend?" Dr. Whitfield paused. "No." Jack gave a quiet, sad smile. Then, "I understand. That evening in the kitchen." William asked, "Are you angry with him?" "No, just sad, for him. Because he doesn't know that feelings don't need to be proven. They just need to be met." Outside, Brutus lay still, like a living statue. But when Jack stepped out, he lifted his head and gave a low, quiet growl, like a grown-up asking, "You okay?" Jack leaned into him and whispered, "Okay, we still have each other." Rumors, suspicion, and public pressure kept growing until the Child Welfare Department, the Animal Protection Agency, and the North Yorkshire Education Board jointly decided to hold an official hearing at Thornfield Farm. Purpose: to assess the living and educational environment of Jack Whitmore. Is the boy being cared for? Or is he bearing a burden that should never have been placed on a child's shoulders? William was anxious. Mrs. Hartwell prayed. Brutus didn't care. He simply lay quietly by the fence of his pen, eyes fixed on the house where everything would unfold. The hay barn was cleared and turned into a makeshift assembly hall. 30 people sat around a round table. Social workers, psychologists, Jack's teacher, several neighbors, and a few silent journalists. Observing. In the center, a small chair. Jack entered. No one called him. He chose to stand in the middle. "My name is Jack Whitmore," he said clearly, hands clenched but not trembling. "I'm 8 years old. I lost my parents, and for a while, I thought I'd never be loved again." Silence. Total. "Then I came here, and I met Brutus. People said he was a dangerous bull. But I saw, he was just like me. A creature in pain, abandoned, and just wanting someone to look into his eyes without fear." A woman from social services flipped through her notebook. "Jack, do you think you're different? Do you ever feel tired from having to heal animals every day?" Jack replied, "I don't heal them. I just stay with them when no one else wants to." A psychologist chimed in, "But you need friends. Play. A childhood." Jack nodded. "I have friends at school. I play tag. I learn math. I draw pictures. But I also have other friends." He pointed toward the cattle pen. And at that very moment, Brutus appeared. No one called him. No one led him. He just showed up. His massive shadow stretched across the entrance of the barn. Not aggressive, not performing, just standing there, silent, as if he sensed that today was the day Jack needed him most. Jack turned back, eyes glowing. "I'm not being used. No one forces me to do anything. I chose to be here, because here, I'm seen." A sniffle echoed in the room. It came from Mrs. Pennington, Jack's teacher. She stood, voice trembling. "I'm responsible for monitoring Jack's academic and emotional development. My conclusion: Jack performs well, socializes normally, and possesses a depth of inner life that adults could learn from." Then came Dr. Peden, the veterinarian. "I once recommended sedation for Brutus. But Jack did something I couldn't. He touched a soul, not with drugs. Not with commands, but with something beyond. The last to stand was the most unexpected drive." Marcus Whitfield. "I once objected to the boy staying here. But after what I've witnessed, perhaps science must relearn humility in the face of what cannot be measured. And this boy, he is where we begin." Jack bowed his head. He said nothing more. Brutus stepped closer, placed his head through the wooden doorway, and touched his nose gently to Jack's shoulder. An action that needed no translation. The entire hall fell silent. Not out of fear, but because, for the first time in their lives, they saw love not as a concept. It had shape. It had breath. It had a name. Jack and Brutus. That afternoon, the late autumn sunlight fell gently through the kitchen window of Thornfield. Honey-colored streaks spread across the wooden floor like warm threads of wool at the edge of winter. In the corner, Jack sat at a small table, pencil in hand, a neatly folded piece of paper laid out in front of him. He was writing his first letter since coming to the farm. Not to be sent, not addressed to anyone, just needed to be written. Dear, anyone who feels like they don't belong anywhere. My name is Jack Whitmore. I used to think I was the only one who found this world too loud, too strange, and too cold. I used to not speak, because no one listened. Then I met a bull named Brutus. He's 10 times bigger than me, 100 times stronger. But I realized, he was scared too. He had been misunderstood. He had waited for someone to say, "You're not a monster." Outside, Brutus lay in the pen. His massive body relaxed under the setting sun, but his ears twitched slightly each time Jack paused his writing. I don't have magic. I don't know how to heal. But I do know how to sit beside someone when they can't say what they feel. I know how not to walk away when everyone else already has. I think that's also a kind of love. If I could say one thing to anyone who's sad, I would say this. Sometimes, the best thing you can do for someone is to sit quietly beside them. Not ask, not fix, just stay. And then, one day, they'll stand up and walk toward the light. Not because you pushed them, but because you didn't leave. Jack folded the letter. On the front, he wrote 2 simple words. For the last listener. Then he placed it in the drawer, where Mrs. Margaret used to keep her baking recipes. That night, William lit the fire. Mrs. Hartwell knitted by the armchair. Jack sat at Brutus's feet, reading aloud to the whole room, in a child's voice. A little unclear, but honest and gentle, like a quilt in the heart of an oncoming winter. Outside, the Yorkshire dales slept in peace. Wind passed through the old stone walls. The sheep dozed together in clumps. And in the large barn, a bull once called a monster was now the keeper of dreams for a boy named Jack. And that dream was no longer alone.